Major questions remain this morning about the agreement reached between the United States and Iran, as specific details are still under wraps. President Trump says the text of the deal will likely be released only after a formal signing ceremony on Friday. Meanwhile, confusion and contradictions continue. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, says Israeli forces will remain in Lebanon. Netanyahu added in a defiant address yesterday, quote, "The struggle has not ended." Iran's foreign minister said this morning that continuing Israeli occupation of Lebanon would be a violation of the deal. We've been tracking this as a key sticking point. Meanwhile, in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran indicated yesterday it intends to charge fees for unspecified services in the key waterway, just a day after President Trump claimed it would reopen and, in his words, be permanently toll-free. And when it comes to potential reconstruction funding for Iran, the president's pushing back on those reports. But a senior U.S. official told reporters yesterday the possibility of releasing frozen funds, sanctions relief, and a big $300 billion fund to rebuild Iran was discussed and would be tied to performance. A senior Iranian official told Reuters the U.S. had agreed to release $25 billion of Iran's frozen assets. Meanwhile, a U.S. official with knowledge of the matter tells MS Now that U.S. intelligence agencies actually warned President Trump that Iranian officials made false claims about nuclear concessions they would make. The warnings were first reported by Axios. The official added that information collected by several U.S. intelligence agencies showed that the way Iranian officials were discussing this interim deal among themselves was actually inconsistent with what they told U.S. officials and mediators. The official went on to say CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Secretary of State Marco Rubio told Trump and other top administration officials that based on the intelligence, they doubted the Iranians would agree to take steps for the nuclear steps that the U.S. has sought. Vice President J.D. Vance and envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner advocated for this deal. We're also hearing from former President Barack Obama, who weighed in on the war with Iran on Saturday, a day before Trump announced that a deal had been made. This is some of what Obama had to say.
It is doubtful that any agreement that arises is going to be significantly different or a significant improvement from the deal that we had in the first place and had worked for a long stretch of time before the United States pulled out of it. The notion that we can just bully our way or bomb our way to solutions may sometimes seem appealing, but the fact of the matter is that taking the time to explore diplomacy and exhaust the possibilities of coming up with deals that don't solve 100% of the problem, but solve 80, 90% of the problem, while avoiding the necessity of going to war. You'd think we would have learned that lesson by now, but it seems like every so often we have to relearn that lesson again.
And of course, we've talked about the shades of similarities, even down to the language being used between this current Trump-era deal and the Obama-era deal back in 2015 with Iran that Trump pulled the U.S. out of during his first term. This present deal looks quite similar. That can't be ignored. Meanwhile, President Trump is in France this morning for the G7 summit, where world leaders are meeting against the backdrop of Middle East tensions and concerns about the global economy. Appearing alongside French President Emmanuel Macron, Trump touted the tentative U.S.-Iran agreement, saying it could bring stability to the Middle East. Macron said France is prepared to send military assets to help secure the Strait of Hormuz and support the reopening of the key global shipping route. Behind the diplomacy, though, many U.S. allies arrived with a more cautious approach toward Washington. European leaders have become increasingly willing to push back on American pressure, reflecting concerns over U.S. unpredictability on everything from trade, security, and, of course, foreign policy. Joining us now live from the site of the G7 summit, White House reporter for Politico, Maya Ward. Maya, the time change actually working with us on this one. Thank you for coming on. You're, of course, on the ground there in France. Can you talk about the conversations that you are hearing on the sidelines of the G7, specifically around the Iran war and the deal that the U.S. is apparently now entered into? The vice president said it was signed.
Yeah, on Iran, I mean, we're talking about this memorandum of understanding and these concessions that the administration, we heard from the president yesterday, he was touting. But the reality is we still have a lot of questions, and we know that Iran hasn't agreed to many of the things that Trump was talking about and touting to world leaders yesterday. I mean, he's saying that the Strait will be permanently toll-free. Iran is saying it may still charge ships. Trump is saying there's no sanctions relief yet, that it's going to be part of these negotiations. There's no agreement over nuclear material. And as you know, Ali, like I said earlier, we haven't seen the text yet, so it's really hard to make sense of what's coming out of both sides. And it presents a challenge for these meetings today. The president in a few hours is going to meet alongside other G7 allies with Middle East leaders, and he's going to have some bilaterals as well. And those partners, those G7 allies, are going to want to know what the actual agreement parameters are, how likely it is for something like this to collapse as they try to chart a path forward. I will say something I'm curious about is how the president is going to push on this issue of demining. It was something that came up on a call with senior officials this weekend, that once the Strait is open, they would begin removing those mines from the Strait, and that G7 allies could be partners in that. So it'd be interesting to see if the president pushes on that front.
And I know that White House officials have been briefing on this memo of understanding, but I guess the simple question is, where is it? When do they think that we will actually see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. We've had a few different answers as to when that's actually going to come. I mean, the president said something yesterday like it might come after that Friday signing. But again, it's going to make this very challenging here at the G7 in terms of trying to get these allies on board with the day after plan, because it's going to be difficult for them to know what to actually agree to when they don't understand the contours of this deal. They haven't seen the text.
Yeah, I also think it's fascinating watching the ways that Vice President J.D. Vance has really been the central messenger around this memo of understanding. He was someone who was reportedly behind the scenes, someone who was not a fan of beginning this conflict in the first place. Now he's the person who's having to sell whatever this deal actually is. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it speaks to the role that he's playing and also just the pressure on this administration as midterms approach to get this thing under wraps. I mean, Republicans for months have been sounding the alarm that if this doesn't end soon, it's going to spell doom for the midterms, and that gas prices and affordability concerns, that all of this was adding to that for Americans. And we know that the vice president, he is interested in 2028. And of course, being the vice president when something like this is happening is always a tricky balancing act, right? You want to support what the president is doing. We saw this with Vice President Kamala Harris as well. But at the same time, you're trying to set yourself up. And so I think that is some of what we're seeing here, this eagerness to show that this is coming to a conclusion. But of course, the challenge there is when you tie yourself closely to something, what happens if it falls apart? And does that fall on Vance in some ways?
And also, what does this deal and what does Iran look like 2 years from now when that 2028 primary is in full swing? This is certainly something that Vance is going to have to answer for, explain, square with his own foreign policy vision if and when he actually becomes a candidate in his own right. The other thing that they're talking about this morning, and we showed some pictures of this earlier while you were speaking, is G7 leaders meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What are the conversations happening around Ukraine and Russia? Because that conflict is still very much front of mind for European leaders, even if it might have faded from the headlines here in the U.S.
Yeah, that meeting's underway right now. And we did see Zelensky and Trump and Macron enter the meeting late. It's not clear quite yet if the president actually had a side chat with Zelensky and Macron before this larger meeting. I actually just pinged some sources with that question. But we did have an interesting hot mic moment where Macron and Zelensky appeared to be discussing the best way to navigate the meeting and President Trump. And it actually happened this morning when Macron was walking outside to greet Zelensky. And you can kind of hear in the footage, it is hard to hear, I will warn you, but you can hear them talking about whether or not a bilateral has been arranged with President Trump. And it sounded like Zelensky said no, but that it's, he wants to meet me. So it'll be interesting to see if we actually do see an opportunity for a pull aside with President Trump. I will just say that, something really interesting right now is for the first time in years, Kiev is actually gaining ground because of its drones. So they've been able to, for the first time since 2023, retake a little bit of the territory that they've lost. And so what will be interesting is that if that is an opportunity for G7 allies who do want Trump to focus more on Ukraine to really push the president to lock back in, and also for allies to push to fulfill Ukraine's needs, whether that's on air defense or long range strike weapons, before the next major Russian offensive.
It's going to be very interesting to see. Hope your sources get back to you. White House reporter for Politico, Maya Ward, on the ground in France. I would say thank you, but I think I should say merci. I appreciate it.